no, I'm not going for office. I mean, my department wouldn't even let me be department chairman because I'd probably ruin everything in 3 seconds,
We're going to be disobedient. Take some more questions.
I understand your general strategy of critiquing mass media involves basically a picture of hegemonic control at the behest of certain corporate political power over some corporate business interests. Do you see or can you envision technological developments like email, internet, things like that, which seem to operate on kind of self-regulative democratic principles, albeit within a very narrow sector of society, as well as a formal structure for democratic discourse?
Well, if you couldn't hear, this was things like what about alternatives like, say, internet and electronic communication and so on, which aren't directly under the control of they're not just big corporations like the media are, so therefore might have other options. It's a complicated question, and I think it's an very interesting question. It'll be interesting to see how it works itself out in the next couple of years. As you correctly said, the internet is for a special sector of society. The internet's for the wealthy. You have to be rich enough or privileged enough to be able to get into it. Yeah, but that's wealthy. I mean, professors like to complain about how bad their salaries are, but they're like up in the stratosphere and getting much too highly paid, in my opinion, by the standards of the general population, including me. But the fact is that you got to be part of the relatively privileged part of the population before you're even part of this thing. Now, for that privileged part of the population, remember that this is a taxpayer-supported operation, so it's just part of the general public subsidy to the rich. It's run through. It was actually started through the Pentagon, which is just the way of funneling public resources to the rich. It's there now, and it's like a lot of things. It has a mixed character. So, for example, I'm sure that there's a lot of thinking going on. You can be certain about whether to allow the internet to exist. Part of the problem with it, from the point of view of powerful interests, is it's just too democratic. It's very hard to control what's in it. In fact, I have a daughter in Nicaragua, and the only way I was able to, you couldn't call telephone or anything during the war period. The only way I could contact her was through the Pentagon, because the ARPANET, which is the core of this thing, which is basically a Pentagon system. I'm in it because I'm in MIT, and somebody there was in it because I don't know why. And you could sort of set up email connections between, say, me and my daughter in Managua during the Reagan War through the Pentagon. Okay, well, that's the kind of thing that happens. And, a lot of people don't like that, obviously. And they don't like the fact that you can get the GATT treaty and you can get the latest news like stuff that I've been talking about, almost all of it you can find on the internet if you look. So that's bad. You got to stop that. Yeah, can you? No email to Cuba? It's interesting. Actually, it's almost cut off to Nicaragua, but not quite. There's still 1 or 2 connections. Yeah, Cuba's interesting. I didn't know that. So that, on the other hand, it has other advantages. It diverts people. It atomizes people. When you're sitting in front of your tube, you're alone. There's something about human beings that makes face-to-face contact very different from banging on a computer and getting some noise coming back. That's very impersonal, and it breaks down personal relations. And that's a good part of it from the point of view of power, because it makes people less human. And a very important thing is to drive human sentiments out of people. So if you can eliminate things like face-to-face contact and, direct interaction and so on, and just, turn people into sort of like what's caricatured as a kind of MIT nerd, somebody who's kind of got an antenna coming out of his head and is wired into his computer. If you can turn everybody into that, it's sort of an advantage, because then you've really made people even more inhuman and therefore more controllable and so on. And there's other complicated things, like, see, one thing I've noticed recently, I don't know if you've noticed this, David, is that a lot of activists are dropping subscriptions to left journals. Why? Because they can get it through the internet. Well, now, if I was in the CIA, I would be saying, look, let's let this thing go, because even if they get the It's true that it has the negative effect of allowing people to get more information, but it has the positive effect of destroying alternative institutions. Okay, so therefore, let's let it go. Because when these guys stop their subscriptions to, I don't know, Z magazine or something, then that's going to destroy that institution, and that'll separate people even more. So if there's anybody, I doubt there's anyone in the CIA with this much brains, but if they had enough brains, they would say, let's let the thing go, because it'll probably destroy the dissident institutions. And it'll destroy them because we're so antisocial that we don't see the point of supporting institutions. Everybody's out for themselves, remember. That's what you're taught from childhood. Even if on the left, you still have that ingrained. Like you're an activist, you still have ingrained in your head, I'm out for myself. And therefore, if I can get the information for nothing, why should I help build an institution? That's a very antisocial attitude. But you find it, it's very hard to break out of it. I mean, we just got it. So, it's got that character. The long-term tendency of the internet, my suspicion is it will be like some article I read somewhere, I forget, maybe the Wall Street Journal or something, which was describing the great potential of this thing. And it went something like this. It said that this is interactive, so it said, well, here's the kind of thing you can look forward to. They're really there's an upbeat account. It said, everybody's going to have this, everybody's going to be tied into it, and we'll be able to have people really interacting in a new way. And then it gave two examples of how it could work, one for women, one for men. For women, they could be sitting there, in front of all their equipment, and on 83 home shopping channels, models show up waving something, and sort of giving you the message, you better have that or else something terrible will happen to you. So they can say, okay, I better have that, and then they can push a button, that's the interactive part, and 10 minutes later, something's delivered at the front door. Okay, that's women interactive. What about men? They said, well, men, like the red-blooded thing to do for men is like watching the Super Bowl. Now when you watch the Super Bowl, it's completely passive, just drinking beer and that sort of thing. But now it's going to be interactive. So before the quarterback's in a huddle and all that sort of thing, and the interactive part will be there'll be a message flashed out to all the red-blooded men, and they'll be supposed to say, look, here's what I think the next play ought to be. Like I think it ought to be a pass, and you push a button and it says pass. And then after the quarterback calls the play, he's not listening to you, of course. Or the coach actually calls the play, I guess, and tells the quarterback. It'll be flashed on the screen, 63% thought it should have been a pass, and so on. That's the interactive part for men. So everybody's really involved now in society, like women buying stuff they don't want and spending money, and men, becoming even more imbecilic than they're already made to be, and so on. And that's all to the good, because that's a way of controlling people. And if you let the thing run, that's where it's going to go, something like that. On the other hand, it does have alternatives. Actually, some of them are being fought about right in Chicago, right now. There's a community-based group, Chicago Media Network or something, which involves Afro-American journalists and teachers union and others who are trying to get an alternative cable channel, a community-based cable channel. Well, I was just told yesterday we were sort of beaten down in the court somewhere, and they're now filing another court suit. But that's the kind of thing that could happen. Now, unless they get support, they're going to lose. If they get public support, they're going to win. And that's exactly the way these things work. You will get public. These things can be useful, very important as alternative sources. In fact, as the only sources. As the real public sources, if people are willing to fight for them. If they're not willing to fight for them, they'll end up with home shopping and the Super Bowl. And you're seeing an example of it right here, right in front of you, in this Chicago Media Action Group. And get involved, you can make a change. Forget about it, nothing will happen. The guys who are always, there's some groups who are always fighting. Big business is always fighting. They don't stop. And if other people aren't involved in the struggle, they win.
Is about the idea that say, for example, many on the left, including yourself, don't have a praxis. And that is partly related, of course, to the absence of the Labour Party in the United States. But also the proposition that the reason why there is a difficulty in organizing on the left in the United States is because the ideology of racism is so pervasive in the United States that it prevents organization among the people who are, of course, who have the most reasons to be dissatisfied with the system. And therefore, I'm implicitly criticizing the left as well. There's racism on the left. And one point that has been made about the distribution of power in the world, especially as it relates to communication, is that and this comes in the form of an anecdote, if Hemingway was Turkish, no one would have heard of Hemingway. My proposition is, if Chomsky was black, would anyone have heard of Chomsky? Or would he just be dismissed as another black man with a chip on his shoulder who's just concerned about black issues?
I don't know. I mean, let's take the publisher that I mainly publish with, South End. The main seller in South End happens to be Bell Hooks, black woman. If you go down a little, it's people like, I'm one of them, but Manning Marable is another, black intellectual. Look, the fact that there's plenty of racism in society, and it's in the left too, absolutely, nobody's going to argue that. Of course there is. But I don't see why it can't be overcome. It can't be overcome, and I think there have been attempts to overcome it. Like, take the Panthers. One of the reasons why Fred Hampton was killed was that he was opening up things to poor whites, and in fact to whites generally. I mean, like, I was at Fred Hampton's funeral, and possibly. I mean, Martin Luther King was popular, First of all, Martin Luther King was opposed, strongly opposed. Like, the Kennedy administration really disliked him, and they tried to block him in every possible way. But it finally got to the point where they couldn't stop it any longer, so they pretended they liked him. But then, and there was a period of sort of popularity for King when he was seen to be focusing on extremely narrow issues, like racist sheriffs in the South and so on. Okay, we can be against that. As soon as Martin Luther King turned to broader issues, whether it was the Vietnam War or remember the Poor People's March was the last one, he became, a pariah. Now, I don't know whether that's why he was killed or not, but he certainly became a pariah because he was just focusing on general issues. And a year or two, about that time, the Panthers were getting organized. And in fact, the Panthers were unusual for an urban-based black group in that they were trying to reach out and did so. There were good connections. I mean, it was a tricky business because the Panthers were like other, any group that's coming out of urban society is going to be a big mixture. So like the Panthers had criminal elements, they had hustlers, they had serious organizers. It was like a mixture of everything. The ones who survived, incidentally, the criminal elements, because the police didn't care much about them. But the Hampton types were destroyed, and they had white-black. I was with a mainly white group, Resist, which had good contacts with the Panthers back in the late 60s. Like I say, I was invited to their funeral. There was no reason why this couldn't continue except that, it wasn't able to resist outside force. So the racism is certainly there, and you got to watch it. But it doesn't seem to me it can't be overcome,
Bell Hooks and Manning Marble actually, I respect a lot because he's actually now developing a practice at Columbia with many of his ideas about shadow cabinets and so on in the United States. But still, the issue is that when these people are presented, certainly by the left and others, they're presented as black intellectuals.
Well, that's because, but he presents himself that way. No, look,
Essentially, a white guy comes.
that's not fair. Look, Manning Marable presents himself that way. It's not that anybody else presents him that way.
Is that the value of his analysis cuts across racial lines.
Sure, but the people who read him understand that.
Pardon me?
People who read him understand that, and they accept his picture of himself as an African-American intellectual, which is correct. That's his picture of himself. I respect that, and you recognize that it holds generally. And look, that's been true of the left for a long time. I take somebody like C.L.R. James. Well, he was a left intellectual, happened to be black, but he was a leading left intellectual. And while you're absolutely right in saying that there's plenty of racism in the left, it seems to me that's the place where there's been least of it. And in fact, it's kind of interesting if you look at labor history. So take, say, the Homestead strike, which I mentioned before. I don't think there were very many blacks there, but there was plenty of the equivalent of racism. I mean, at that time, it was against the Huns. Anybody from Eastern Europe was called a Hun. You know, it's like from Slovakia or Hungary or anything like that. And they were treated just like blacks. And there was vicious ethnic hatreds in Homestead and that region. They were overcome during the strike. That was the first time that people actually cooperated across ethnic grounds, because they were fighting together for something. That happened in the formation of the CIO. Then it was a lot of black workers. Black and white workers were actually working together on the CIO. And it seems to me there are plenty of common, and that happened in the civil rights movement. You know, there are plenty of common struggles which bring people together. Like SNCC, for example, was very open. You know, it was white, black, anything. SNCC got destroyed, and I think that's part of the reason for it. So your point is right. The society is very racist. It's got other kinds of divisions, and you got to keep conscious of them, and you have to overcome them. About the praxis point, I'm not so sure I agree. I mean, you know, when you say there's no praxis, I don't exactly know what that means. I mean, there are plenty of things that can be done. I don't think they have to be described with fancy terms. And we do the things that can be done, you know, the kinds of things that are the next stage where we are now. And I don't think that there's any general formulas about that. You just ask where you are, you know, what are the problems that exist, where are people ready to move, and you try to do something with them. There's a spectrum of them, and there's no simple answer as to which ones should have the priorities. People judge differently. But I'm very skeptical if somebody comes down with a praxis, you know, like some formula saying, here's the way we're supposed to do it. I'd be really skeptical about that.
We have time for one more question, a brief question, because we have about 5 minutes, or else the dean will be.
First of all, I want to say just very quickly that last night I saw this Time magazine with the front cover regarding that IQ book that you had mentioned, and I was just appalled by it.
No,
because I thought if I was
racism,
a black man in this country, I would not know what to do with myself.
How about if you're a black woman?
O.J. Simpson.
How about a black woman? Did you read the article?
Or a black
I mean, the
woman.
article claims that one of the things it discusses is the idea that black women don't nurture their children. You know, and that's because they came from Africa where the climate was such and such. You know, I mean, you know, this is stuff that's right out of the Nazis. You know.
It's just, I was thinking, how would I feel? You know what, I don't know what to do. I mean, it's just rage. Maybe I would wake up every day, maybe I'd be despondent, maybe I try to relate to other people as human beings, but inside there would be a burning fire.
See, but I think I mean, I agree with that emotional reaction, but if you think about it, the right way to respond is to ask, what are they doing it for? And they're doing it for a very simple reason. Like I said last night, 40% of the kids in New York, most of them who are black and Hispanic, are living below the poverty line. That means they're destroyed. Okay. Well, you can't, and that's the result of very definite social policies which are supported by the New York Times. Okay. There are certain social policies which are driving people down to destruction. Well, you can't say that plainly. So you need some cover. Well, what's the cover? Okay, bad genes. You know, who knows? Maybe, you know. And once you understand that, then you know how to deal with it. You know. Well, you know, it's not that their audience wants to hear that. It's that, I mean, some of it does. It's that that's the proper ideology. Just as it was proper for the Nazis at some point to say Jews are a virus that's destroying our society, it is proper for the New York Times to run articles taking seriously the idea that black mothers don't nurture their children. And like, take me, Ashkenazic Jews, we're supposed to be at the top. We have small families because that's what we're like. That's why my mother came from a family with 11 kids, you know, because Ashkenazic Jews have small families. Of course, she was an East European, you know, living in a peasant society. Maybe that had something to do with it. No, that's not what social science tells you. Okay, well, that's, you know, these things are such transparent ideological weapons that you shouldn't even bother arguing about them. We should just understand them transparently for what they are. I'm in a real commissar culture, which is dedicated to trying to obscure the most elementary truths, and therefore is able to do things like this on the front cover of the New York Times. Well, that's the world we're living in. And, you know, you can understand the emotional reaction, and it's easily understandable, but it's not the right one, because what's going on is very transparent.